Welcome to Notebook Summaries. Today, we're going to talk about one of the weirdest and deadliest disasters in American history. Seriously, it's a story that involves corporate greed, a man-made tidal wave in the middle of a city, and safety rules that actually keep you safe today. And the villain of the story? Believe it or not, it's Molasses.
So, let's set the scene. The date is January 15th, 1919, and for Boston, it's a weirdly warm day. We're talking over 40 degrees Fahrenheit. People are outside, probably enjoying a break from the winter cold. Then, right around noon, this deep, groaning sound just rips through the neighborhood. At first, everyone probably thought, oh, it's just the elevated train, but they were wrong. It was something so much stranger and a whole lot deadlier.
2.3 million gallons. That's how much industrial molasses was inside this monster of a steel tank. It was 50 feet tall, owned by a company called United States Industrial Alcohol. We're talking about 13,000 tons of thick, syrupy goo just unleashed all at once onto the streets of Boston.
And you know, this wasn't some slow-motion ooze you see in cartoons. No way. This was a wave of molasses, sometimes reaching up to 40 feet high, smashing through the neighborhood at 35 miles an hour. Think about that, the speed of a freight train. It had enough force to twist the steel supports of the elevated railway, flatten buildings, and just toss people and horses around like they were nothing.
This wasn't just about property damage. This was deadly. 21 people were killed. 150 more were injured. You know, it's easy to hear molasses flood and kind of chuckle, right? But what happened that day was a true human tragedy, and it was all because of a whole chain of terrible decisions.
All right, so the big question is, how does something like this even happen? How do millions of gallons of molasses just explode? Well, to figure that out, we got to look at the tank itself. And let me tell you, this thing was a ticking time bomb from day one.
Okay, but first, you might be wondering, why on earth did they have a giant tank of molasses in the middle of Boston? Well, it was big business. For centuries, Boston was a hub for the rum trade, and you need molasses to make rum. But this was 1919, right after World War I. That molasses was being used to make industrial alcohol, a key ingredient for weapons and ammunition. And, get this, the company was in a huge hurry to process it all before Prohibition started, so the tank was filled to the brim.
And the thing is, this tank was basically screaming for help for years. It was thrown together back in 1915, built cheap and fast. People who lived nearby said you could hear it groaning and creaking whenever it was full. It leaked constantly, so much that local kids would literally bring buckets to collect the free molasses dripping down the sides. And then, just the day before it burst, they pumped in a new shipment of molasses that was warmer than the stuff already in there. That temperature difference probably caused the contents to expand, putting the final fatal pressure on those already failing walls.
This is the part that's just infuriating. When we look back at it now, the problems are so obvious. The steel walls, way too thin, like half as thick as they should have been. The steel itself was brittle. The rivets were bad. And what did the company do about all this?
Did they fix it?
Nope. They painted the tank brown so you couldn't see the leaks as easily. They flat out ignored an employee who told them the tank was unsafe. They never even bothered to do the simplest safety test, like filling it with water first. It was just complete and total negligence.
So that's the corporate side of the story. Now let's talk about the real cost of that negligence. This wasn't just about a broken piece of equipment. It was about the lives that were shattered in an instant.
This quote from the Boston Post really paints a horrifying picture. The molasses wasn't like water, where you could swim to the surface. It was a thick, sticky trap. Horses got stuck and died. The paper said it was like so many flies on sticky flypaper. People were either killed instantly by the force of the wave, or they were trapped and slowly suffocated as the molasses got cold and started to harden. It made rescuing anyone almost impossible.
And it's when you see the names that the tragedy really hits home. These were real people, city workers, fathers, mothers. Two of the victims, Maria DiStasio and Pasquale Iantasca, were just kids, 10 years old. They were just out gathering firewood when it happened. A firefighter, George Leahy, was killed when the wave literally picked up his entire firehouse and slammed it down, crushing him inside. The power was just unimaginable.
But you know, even in the middle of all that horror, there were heroes. The first people to respond were a group of 116 naval cadets from a training ship, the USS Nantucket, which was docked right there. They didn't hesitate, they just ran right into that knee-deep, sticky nightmare to pull people out.
Soon, Boston police, the Red Cross, soldiers, and sailors all joined in, working for 4 straight days in that awful mess, looking for anyone they could save.
So after the rescue efforts, the next chapter began. The city had to figure out how to clean up this unbelievable mess. And maybe even more importantly, the families of the victims had to start their long, hard fight for justice.
So how do you even begin to clean up 2.3 million gallons of molasses? It took hundreds of workers weeks and weeks. Eventually they figured out that salt water worked best, so they brought in fireboats to just spray down the streets. But that stickiness, it got everywhere. People tracked it all over the city, onto the subways, into their own homes. There was this saying that for months, everything you touched in Boston was sticky. Naturally, with 21 people dead and a neighborhood destroyed, everyone was asking one question: who is to blame for this? And that question kicked off one of the very first big class action lawsuits in the history of Massachusetts. And this is where things got really interesting. The company, USIA, had a story ready to go. They tried to blame it on anarchists, trying to tap into the fear of immigrants at the time, claiming they blew up the tank with a bomb. It was a complete fabrication. The victims' families fought back, and after a huge legal battle that lasted 5 years and involved more than 1,000 witnesses, the court finally reached a verdict. The truth came out: the tank failed because it was built badly. Period. The company had to pay out a settlement that would be worth over $8 million today.
So, the court case was a huge deal, but the legacy of this weird, tragic flood goes way beyond just a legal settlement. In fact, its impact is something that still protects all of us, right now, today.
This disaster was a massive wake-up call for the whole country. The trial showed that, back then, there were basically no rules for this kind of construction. And because of this flood, that changed. All those common-sense safety rules we just assume exist, things like, an architect actually has to show their calculations, a certified engineer has to sign off on the plans, and a city inspector has to approve the project, all of that became standard practice pretty much everywhere, all because a giant tank of molasses exploded in Boston.
So those new laws were the official legacy. But the flood also left behind something a little more ghostly. For decades after the disaster, people who lived in that neighborhood swore that on hot summer days, they could still smell molasses, just a faint, sweet smell hanging in the air, a constant reminder of what happened there.
And really, that's the whole story in a nutshell. It's one of those things that sounds too bizarre to be true, right? A molasses tsunami? But it's a very real and very powerful example of how corporate negligence can lead to absolute tragedy. And thankfully, it's also a story about how even the weirdest disaster can spark changes that end up protecting us all. Hey, if you thought this story was fascinating, you should definitely check out our Unusual History Events playlist. We've got a bunch more stories just like this one. And, of course, if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button for notebook summaries. We put out new explainers like this every week. Thanks so much for watching.